Good day, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking PMI Africa for having me here today, and I'd like to thank those of you attending my discussion this afternoon. If your days are anything like mine since we went into lockdown, it's been meeting after meeting. I really appreciate your taking the time from your schedules to be here. I'm going to be talking about practical agility today and the lessons I've learned when shifting organizations and teams from waterfall to agile. I want to emphasize that what I'm going to be talking today has been my experience. It's lessons I've learned in the field when working with software development teams who have been through the shift. And it's by no means going to be the same as every other project manager's experience or as every book or academic paper. What I hope you will come away with today is a feel for the kinds of issues that can lie in wait for the unwary project manager, and hopefully some useful tips to add to your arsenal when you embark on the same process. So without further delay, let's move right into the inevitable introduction of myself and how I came to be here today. My name is Philippa Tite, and I'm a PMP, I'm an ACP, and I'm a certified Scrum Master. I also achieved my MBA far too long ago. I worked in IT my entire adult life, predominantly in the sales and marketing spaces for project management. And I've worked in web, hardware, networks, network services, as well as software development. I started my own company about 7 years ago called Purple Raindrop, and we have two arms. So one specializes in digital marketing, and the other is a project management arm where we've spent most of our time assisting organizations to produce viable software while transitioning from waterfall to agile methodologies. I'm 100% committed to servant leadership and all that entails. And those of you who I've met over the years at the various exam development workshops and other PMI events know that I'm an ardent supporter of agile project management, women in tech, and the growth and development of the beautiful country where I live, South Africa. All of these are, of course, topics that I can generally be persuaded to expound upon at length over a glass of wine. Today I'm going to be discussing what I've learned in my journey moving waterfall teams and organizations to agile. But before I do, I need to give you some context. I'm going to be discussing two very specific organizations who, for obvious reasons, will remain incognito. The first company we will be discussing we'll call Company A. They're based in South Africa with retail stores into many African countries. This company was trying to implement a large-scale ERP, which would require a rewrite of a lot of the internal software modules which were vital for keeping the business functioning. By the time they decided to explore Agile, this project had already overrun by more than $10 million. But they had a fairly new leadership who was keen to just get things done, and it was an exciting thing to start with. The goal was to migrate all the IT projects to an agile way of working, beginning with the one team and spreading out from there. Part of my mandate was to write up the training program and implement it with the wider teams. I'd be joining a well-established software development team who worked largely in isolation with input from various SMEs throughout the business. The company itself was very traditional in many ways. If you had worked there for less than 7 years, you were still considered new. The culture was very established, and the team I was starting with worked in a different physical location to the rest of the IT and operated pretty much as a law unto itself. The second company I'm bringing in for comparative purposes was very different. The project we were starting was to augment an existing agri-software product while upgrading to a new version of Oracle. The leadership was fairly well established, having all been there a long time, and the project the project team we put together came from all different areas of the business. The company was a purveyor of software, so they had a very different regard for budget to Company A, and they wanted to adopt an agile way of working as they believed it would assist them to get product out faster with a better quality and at a lower cost. But let's move on to the theory. Albert Einstein has a great quote. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And in this case, the theory tells us the best candidates to make the move from waterfall to agile are those who want to make the change. But just wanting to make the change isn't enough. There have to be practical things in place before a change of this magnitude can be considered, let alone implemented. Anthony Messino, a New York-based agile advocate and trainer who's prolific online and has some great insights, believes that if we follow certain patterns, making this move from waterfall to agile will be a lot simpler. And that may be so in the American context, or even to a certain extent in the European or the Australian context. But this is Africa, and the only place we like our patterns here is on our fabrics. That's not to say we need to ignore everything else that's been learned in other environments. But we really do need to critically assess what has worked where in order to get to those little nuggets that we can use effectively in our own context. Africa is unique. We have unique issues here, and we can't be dealt with in a cookie-cutter fashion. As we know, waterfall is linear and insists that if you do not know everything there is to know about a project, you can't plan up front, whereas Agile is iterative and expects you to have a limited knowledge of the detail from the very start. In an environment as uncertain as Africa, politically, financially, and socio-economically, it would seem that Agile would be more similar to our way of thinking and therefore a better fit. So what should we be thinking about? Company A had taken 22 months from the start of their Agile journey through training and ultimately had one entire team that was 100% Agile using Scrum. And the remainder of the teams had implemented, at the very least, backlogs, stand-ups, and grooming. But each team was working at their own pace. Company B had taken 24 months and had 2 teams that were committed to Agile and were working entirely in this fashion. The remainder of the teams, the majority of them, had stayed on waterfall for a number of reasons, and we'll go over those in the coming slides. During and after our journey with our clients, with these and other organizations, we've completed retrospectives with the teams and each other, and we wanted to understand the differences and the commonalities between the various environments. Based on our findings, we grouped our answers into 6 main themes which impacted on the successful adoption, or not, as the case may be, of Agile. Those themes were, in no particular order, cost, reasons for the change, the culture, the leadership, the supporting processes in the organization, and whether or not the organization itself, was a learning organization. But we're going to look at each of these one by one. The first one is reasons for change. Many companies cite different reasons for wanting to make this change, but Prosky's change management and Agile report distilled it into 3 definitive motivations: to increase the speed and delivery of a higher quality product, to ensure client satisfaction and continuous engagement to address their needs, and to optimize efficiencies and flexibility for faster benefit realization. In my examples, Company A brought me in to assist in a project that had already failed badly and where their executives were under enormous pressure to deliver something of value for the cost that had already been incurred. They were hoping to staunch the flow of money while still delivering a project of enormous magnitude. But here's the thing, many of the reasons that it had failed in waterfall were still there when we transitioned to Agile. Those underlying issues weren't dealt with, and Agile wasn't the band-aid that the client thought it would be. What it did do, however, was expose many of the issues that had been previously buried in paperwork and reports and that had been equivocated with regards to performance and timelines. Suddenly there was visibility and accountability in the teams as they held people to their commitments, and more people issues began to come to the fore where they could be dealt with or not, as the case may be, appropriately. Company B, on the other hand, had a very different agenda. As a development house, they were essentially a body shop. And don't think I can't see every single person who is a servant lead or a scrum master in the room squirm when I use that term. They sold time by the hour, they sold teams by the hour, and they'd started on their Agile journey because of a call to improve productivity and quality and cut costs. They had also been promised a 30% reduction in their costs if they went the Agile route. This was a claim made by a dodgy solution provider selling a framework of Agile that was anything but Agile. I want to point out that this was also done previous to my engagement with them. And from the very first conversation I had with them, I told them those kinds of promises were absolute nonsense. Nevertheless, they were very keen to proceed, and their executive team were quite committed to moving to Agile, as they had this idea of cost savings in sight. They weren't quite ready to relinquish that vision yet. It did, however, become evident fairly fast that they were really on track to sabotage themselves with a culture that didn't necessarily lend itself to proper adoption of this change. A long, hard look at what they were wanting to do and why, coupled with Agile coaching that didn't overpromise, was really what was needed to make it work. Whatever the reasons for making the change, we can tell you this. As the project manager, it behooves you to spend some time with the stakeholders in your organization before you embark on this ambitious transition and really understand what they expect or want out of this change. What we learned in both our case study clients here is that if you don't address all the underlying assumptions on how Agile will change their world and manage that expectation from the very, very, very beginning, you'll ultimately have to deal with disappointment and finger pointing later on. Let's move on to leadership. I'm sorry, I'm moving between screens, so it's a little tricky. Wanasika, Howell, Little, and Dorfman did a study on managerial leadership and culture in sub-Saharan Africa and noticed that all the countries studied, which was South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria, had common themes. The central one, however, was that of Ubuntu, which by their definition is reflected in high levels of group solidarity, paternalistic leadership, and humane-orientated leadership. Let's take a closer look. Here we go. Let's take a closer look at the idea of paternalistic leadership. It's defined by businessdictionary.com as a type of fatherly managerial style, typically employed by dominant males where their organizational power is used to control and protect subordinate staff. Bearing this leadership style in mind when dealing with our companies across Africa can be really helpful in understanding the journey that they'll need to take. In every change, it is the leadership who set the tone for how well the change will be adopted. Agile has a very flat structure. Teams are encouraged to question, to agree on how they will work together, and to hold each other accountable. There are no sacred cows in an Agile organization, and there are no sacred cows in an Agile team. In our examples, Company A thought of itself as a very flat structure. But as I mentioned in my opening slides, they just employed a new leadership who were all about adding in layers and empire building in the various silos. There was a strong sense of paternalistic leadership and a fair number of those willing to sacrifice the good of the organization on the altar of self-promotion. Company B's leadership structure already conformed to the very traditional hierarchy, but in this case, the leadership were possibly not emotionally equipped to deal with a lot of the changes and the more questioning nature of an Agile team, and it really did take some getting used to on their behalf. In both cases, the leadership structure and the attitude weren't the ideal time to start an Agile change. But surprisingly, the change was harder for Company A, with their history of being flexible and open to new ideas, than it was for Company B, who had a lot more structure in place. As I said previously, Company B's leadership didn't take too kindly to being questioned and also being told that some things were no longer possible. And to a certain extent, they resented the team's newfound independence and ability to say no when the teams deemed their demands unreasonable. But as much as they didn't like the change, they coped with a lot of help from a very firm Scrum Master. Company A wasn't quite so easy to contain. The politics, the jostling for power in the leadership strata made it very difficult to come to cohesive decisions and find positive ways to move forward with the team. A more open and honest leadership layer could have supported the team through the change and been in a position of strength to resolve issues in a responsible and mature fashion. I find culture such a fascinating aspect of Agile transformation. We've all heard that much overused saying of Peter Drucker's that culture eats strategy for breakfast, the one on my slide at the moment. As an MBA, I believed wholeheartedly that strategy was everything. If you had a good strategy and great troubleshooting scenarios, you could do anything. And then I became a project manager, where, as every single one of us here today can attest to, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, in the words of Robert Burns. There's a good reason that Drucker's saying is overused. It's because it's true. The ideal candidate organization for a waterfall to Agile transformation is one that has an aspirational culture. It aspires to be better. It aspires to grow and improve. It's an organization that has a very high self-awareness. Its people know and understand their organization, and they believe wholeheartedly in its vision and want to help it get there. It's also an organization that welcomes customer involvement and is willing to go above the personal to achieve great things. I had a really interesting experience with Company B. I was in Botswana working with one of their teams on their first Agile project. And a few weeks into the process, I realized that the technical team lead had made a rather large mistake, which was going to cost us enormous amounts of rework. As it transpired, the BA knew all about the error, and when I questioned why it wasn't raised at any of the stand-ups, the retrospectives, the grooming, or as part of holding each other accountable, I received the answer that it wasn't raised as the BA couldn't question a senior who had worked in the organization for a long time. Dug a little deeper, as you do, and the BA was genuinely uncomfortable as she felt that she was telling on a senior and it wasn't her place. The gent in question was older, had been in the organization longer, and was male. All factors that may not be relevant in a Western culture like the USA, but which played a significant role in this office in Botswana. When we shift organizations, we need to take into account the organizational culture as well as the larger social culture in which they exist. You can over time change an organizational culture, but shifting someone's frame of reference, that very fabric that makes up their cultural norms and values, that's a different thing entirely. Another aspect that has to be taken into account is that of the PMO itself. One afternoon, not long after we started our work at Company A, the portfolio, in a throwaway comment that was meant to be a joke, said to me that if we had our way, there would be no project managers left to control things. This statement alone was very telling of the culture within the PMO. It speaks to a culture of controlling rather than facilitating work. It's a subtle difference, but it's one that makes an enormous impact on the way in which we approach our teams. Ironically, in a truly agile team, the project manager will have more and not less control over the project itself. They will have more visibility into issues through daily stand-ups and retrospectives. They'll have more control over project budgets and value added to the customer through MVP prioritization and delivery. They'll have a much better grasp of deliverable work and timelines through sprint planning and backlog grooming. And ultimately, they'll have better communication with the team. What they won't have is more control over the people in the team. This particular portfolio manager at Company A had a very paternalistic style of leadership, and he liked working within the structure of a waterfall project. Ultimately, he couldn't cope with the change, and he actually left the organization. I'd like to say a few words on trust and culture. Company B started their agile journey with all the right intentions, but what they hadn't considered when they began converting teams to agile is that the structure of their performance management system would have to change. And I don't just mean their performance management software, but their entire system of interconnected parts. This presented more than a few challenges for a large, publicly traded corporate company who would have to have different key performance metrics for their teams who essentially fill the same role. Now, I don't know about you guys, but most HR teams I've worked with really do like to take the individualized H out of their R's because they can't afford to be accused of any kind of special treatment or pandering. So they have to keep everything exactly the same for their staff. At the time of Company B's change, there were a number of trust issues between staff and management. The teams weren't quite convinced that the organization had their best interests at heart. As I said, it wasn't the best time to be attempting such a monumental change. But what made it very difficult, and in fact nearly crippled the entire transformation process, was that one of the executives decided a key metric would be to measure teams against each other based on their velocity. For those of you who don't know, in Scrum we use story points to estimate complexity of work. Those story points are relative to each other within the team. So, for example, I could have a user story with one team, which one team estimates to be five user story points effort, and another estimates to be 13. One team could have an average velocity of 60 points a sprint, while another team with the exact same stories could have an average velocity of 90 points. The numbers themselves are absolutely irrelevant until they start being used to measure things they weren't designed for, like as metrics on a KPI. This mistake and the staff's passive-aggressive response, which was to immediately inflate all their estimates, obviously, threw off the velocity measures, which took us another 3 sprints to regulate, and not to mention an enormous amount of time and effort undoing the idea that implementing Agile was just another way to control or manage the team instead of emancipating them. You'll also need to have a culture that is comfortable with the client playing a continuous and very active role in the project. We found when implementing at Company B that their long-term relationship with their client made for a lot of trust. The fact that the client was at grooming sessions as well as retros and sprint planning meant that they took on just as much ownership for the project as Company B's team. But they could and did choose how to spend their budget as they were part of the risk assessment and prioritization process. This meant no scary surprises when implementation came about and ultimately a much happier client. I've spoken a lot about culture. But the truth is that in order to make this transformation work effectively, you really do need to understand the culture of the organization you're working with, as well as how to leverage the aspects of that culture that will support an agile transformation, like high trust, low power distance, respect, and honest communication, while reducing those aspects of the culture that will hinder the change. Let's take a look at learning organizations now. Again, referring to Prosky, in their research they found that the more effectively the move to Agile was managed, the more effective the organization was when using Agile on projects. And of course, it goes without saying that an organization that learns makes for the best kind of transformation plans. In a lot of organizations today, the majority of the staff are I-shaped people, those with immense knowledge and skill in one area. What we're starting to see, however, especially in Agile organizations, is the rise of the T-shaped staff member. In Agile teams, we do what we need to do, sometimes across disciplines, in order to deliver on the commitment that we've made for that sprint. T-shaped people have a good depth of knowledge and skill in their area, as well as reasonable breadth of knowledge and skill across multiple disciplines. This is really important in an Agile team, like, for example, a company B, where developers will act as testers if there's a backlog on a sprint. After Company A had been at this Agile transformation thing for a while and had gone through a number of versions of the same Agile training, because them not being a learning organization, we had to do it a couple of times. I remember sitting with one of the SMEs who would be actually using the software once we had implemented it. We were doing a grooming session, and what rocked me back on my heels was the phrase, "No, it's not really necessary, but it's so pretty." And I realized at that moment that despite the repeated training sessions on minimum viable products, it was going to take a lot longer and a lot more training sessions to really inculcate the philosophy behind some of the concepts that we were trying to get across. The organization itself liked the idea behind learning and retros and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't an instinctual thing for them. They're in retail. They've been doing the same thing for years and years and years, and change was really, really hard. Company B, on the other hand, and maybe because their core business was software, had no trouble understanding things like MVP and value to customer. What they struggled to understand was that the value for the clients, what they struggled to understand was that the value for the clients and themselves wasn't actually in the process, it wasn't actually in the output, it was actually in the process. For an organization that liked to allocate people 100% of every single day, and they needed to make sure that productivity was at an absolute maximum, the idea that to speed up we had to slow down completely baffled them. But companies learn in different ways. And we found that a thorough, deliberate change management process with all the fun, cool, marketing type stuff like posters and desk drops, mails, as well as training sessions and value workshops made the learning easier. As did finding Agile champions in each team and working with them to ensure a consistent message as we slowly built the Agile world within their existing organizations. Let's take a look now at some of the supporting processes. What we found in every organization that we've worked in is that a thorough change management approach is needed. And just like an Agile transformation process, there's no one-size-fits-all here. Your change management needs to work from the top down through every single layer of the business and needs to reflect not only the Agile framework you'll be implementing, it needs to truly represent the spirit of that transformation as well. It has to be visible. The leaders of the organization need to communicate why they want this change, what benefits it will bring to the organization as a whole, as well as to the individuals and the teams. And most importantly, the communication needs to be effective and timely. People need time to get used to change. They need to understand why they are going to be uncomfortable for a while. And they need to be nurtured, coached, and sometimes gently maneuvered in the right direction. A leadership team that are clear about their reasons for the change, and that adopt the change themselves and unequivocally support the changes made, will instill a confidence in their teams to move forward. It's also important that a critical assessment of current work tools take place. Like, for example, when Company B realized that their staff performance management tools were going to need to be overhauled to accommodate for the change. Or when Company A realized that teams who needed to work together would need actual physical tools like Jira in order to manage the work. With a change to how work is quoted, accepted, and actually done, there's going to be a change in the requirements from staff for more different tools. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And a change that is going to affect all areas of the business, from hiring new staff to invoicing customers, will need you to do a step through of all the processes and a frank assessment of those tools that will be needed and those that still add value and those that don't. One of the supporting processes that I would just like to emphasize is that of the project manager. It's funny how the teams I work with call me their Scrum Master, while the leadership tend to call me their project manager. The one values autonomy and self-reliance with the servant leader, and the other requires more structure and control and management. Many who go through this transformation believe that the edict of communication over paperwork means no more paperwork. I'm here to tell you that's not the case. In every organization where we have worked on making this agile transformation, we have found that we fulfill a dual role. We manage the teams like a scrum master and the business like a project manager. Very often, the leadership need more, not less information to make them comfortable with the changes we're making. This requires working within the PMO guidelines on, for example, when we hold steer comms, what project updates look like and when they go, those kinds of things. A lot of this won't go away, especially as the majority of organizations will run hybrid methodologies for a period. There is still budgetary reporting, earned value reports and the like. There is more communication than ever before, and more visibility too, which can lead to even more questions and more reporting. So let's take a look at my last theme now, that of cost. Change isn't cheap. You're going to need a budget, a realistic one. There will be obvious costs like formal training for those who will be affected, change management materials, internal and external marketing materials, but there'll also be a lot of less obvious costs. Like, for example, the opportunity cost to have staff on training and not at work, the costs of making a total mess of new processes and having to redo things while they learn, what my team like to call the bugger-up tax. There will also be costs involved in, for example, building out a new cost model for customers. If we change the way we work and we spend a lot more time on planning and understanding the work we're doing and a shorter time executing it, how will our payment milestones be affected? And how will that affect our running costs? Any interim shareholder reporting will also need to be changed, and how do we do that? In my case, both Company A and Company B believed that Agile would give them immediate cost savings. What it did in reality was cost Company A a whole bunch of money as we trained and implemented new workflow processes as well as tools. Because we were handling it in an agile fashion, we could call priority and we knew what MVP looked like from early on, but there was no immediate cost savings. In fact, quite the opposite for the first few months. In the case of Company B, costs immediately affected their clients, but it did actually save them money from the very start. And this was because in their waterfall projects, their clients committed to fixed price and fixed scope. As projects started, what the development teams didn't know was a lot, and it was a little bit like a V-shaped tunnel. As the project progressed, they knew more, and very often they had missed a requirement or hadn't fully understood the various technical issues. There was a trend of overrun on projects due to this missed scope, but the risk was now shifted to the clients, as they were also part of the scoping and the requirements gathering. So in summary today, I've probably scared the hell out of you. And I'm not going to lie, it hasn't always been easy. And for a servant leader like me who just wants everyone to hold hands, sing kumbaya, and make beautiful software together, it has sometimes been downright uncomfortable. But it can be done. And it has been done. It's been done successfully, but it just has to be done carefully. A project manager with an autocratic patriarchal mindset will struggle with the shift just as much as their team. And as every project manager knows only too well, our teams look to us for guidance. A leader who exudes ambivalence is just as likely to fail as one who tries to make the shift as a dictator. There's a lot of soul searching from the PM side when you embark on the shift. Flexibility and knowledge is the key to making it work. And if nothing else, our project managers are designed to be flexible, right? I'd like to close by thanking you so much for spending time with me today. My contact details are here, and I'd love to continue the chat. Have a wonderful day.